And joining us now to discuss the current situation in Georgia is Ján Michalčák, political scientist and international security expert. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So what would you say is next for Georgia and for the response of Western countries? It seems like the Georgian Dream government has no plans of backing down. Quite the opposite. They are firmly entrenched in their desire to bring this piece of legislation into practice.
Unfortunately, you're right, and my outlook for the future of Georgia, I have to say, is quite negative because, as your viewers will most likely know, the law that the Georgian parliament and the Georgia Dream Party introduced is most likely going to be used to target the perceived enemies of the Georgian government, mainly NGOs that receive any sort of funding from what Georgia hopes to be essentially the country's allies in the West, the EU, the US. And the government is set to use that law to label, stigmatize, and I'm afraid further limit the actions of whomever the government perceives as a foreign agent, which is a very broad definition indeed, and limit their activities in Georgia. And that, as a result, could ultimately lead to the doors to the EU being shut for Georgia. And, the country obviously hopes to join the EU and potentially even NATO one day. And with that, as foreign leaders have indicated already, this prospect is getting more and more distant for Georgia, unfortunately, I have to say.
So President Zurabishvili, she has 5 days to endorse this legislation, but obviously this is a mere formality. In terms of this bill, which will now become legislation, how quickly can we see this being implemented, and how quickly can we see this affecting the day-to-day lives of regular Georgians?
I'm very sorry I have to say that, but I really believe that the effects are going to be pretty much immediate. Because as I said, the main purpose and the immediate aim and goal of the legislation is ultimately to label and stigmatize the NGOs, and the effects will need to be immediate according to law, if and when it passes, of course, and which means that the actions and further activities of NGOs based in Georgia will need to be affected right now, and either the NGOs comply and label themselves as foreign agents, which could and most likely would lead to the stigmatization, probably even withdrawal of funding by their sponsors so far, and can even down the line lead to the strengthening of the law by the Georgian government, because we have to remember that the law, which is essentially inspired by a very similar piece of legislation in Russia, was also in Russia so vague at the start, but it was used as a stepping stone for Putin's government to then later make the law more and more stringent and use the label of foreign agents as a way to further limit their actions, further limit, for example, their access to public funding, their access to the governments, their ability to monitor the freedom and fairness of elections, and I could go on. So the NGOs will have to comply right now, and if they do not, the penalties written in the law are quite severe, and they themselves, the penalties, could and probably would be used as a way to essentially silence the NGOs, because if the NGO doesn't comply, it will have to pay a hefty fine, which many of the NGOs simply can't afford to pay.
So what incentives could be used by Western countries, both the European Union and the United States, to ensure that the government perhaps thinks twice about its next move? We've recently heard reports that travel sanctions will be introduced for members of the government. And now, we have a tendency at laughing these off. I mean, they hardly ever work against members of any authoritarian regimes or indeed governments which are on their path towards becoming ones. So what would you say would be the best way of actually reacting to this?
I think the prospects are really quite bleak for Georgia because let's remember the government already had at least 2 or 3 attempts to, as you say, think twice. There were attempts to pass the law even last year, and the talk has been quite long about whether and when it passes. And ultimately, the government has decided to go ahead in spite of the massive protests, in spite of the protests even turning violent, which of course led to Western leaders condemning the government and the actions that the police conducted. But still, the government presses on. So I am not sure that anything the Western leaders could do could essentially stop the Georgian government, because it seems dead intent on passing the legislation and basically strengthening its ties with Russia, because let's remember, that's the ultimate goal of the Georgian government, I strongly believe.
Just to look at Georgian society, just looking internally a little bit, we know that Georgia has parliamentary elections that are coming up later in the year. Would you just give us a little bit of insight in regards to the domestic politics, but also a little bit in regards to Georgian society? Because not so long ago, just after quite a few days of these protests, there was quite a large demonstration to celebrate the Georgian family and perhaps more of those conservative circles in Georgia. So if you could just give us a little bit of insight as to the makeup of Georgian society as well.
Sure, that's a great question. Obviously, as any other society in the world, the Georgian society is definitely not monolithic. But what I can say with certainty is that a great portion of the Georgian society is very pro-European, pro-Western. And we've seen that trend growing and growing since the illegal occupation of significant portions of the Georgian territory began in 2008. Let's remember, Russian troops are currently stationed just some 30 kilometers away from its capital. So the danger to the country's existence is quite severe, and that led to many more people starting to support Georgia's path to the European Union and NATO, because they simply, and it's quite logical, see those two bodies, the EU and NATO, as a way to secure the country's existence and survival into the future. So significant portions have supported EU and NATO memberships. We've seen that on the significant numbers of people protesting against the law, and they're not going to stop, which good on them. And I hope the protests do bring benefits to Georgian society. But judging by the violent actions taken by the authorities, I'm unfortunately remaining quite pessimistic, at least in the immediate future. But on the other hand, as I said, I really don't think that the push of the Georgian society for an EU future or a NATO future is going to stop. Quite the opposite. So at least in the medium to long term, I hope that that could change, but certainly not in the election that's coming up in October. For that election, I would be afraid that the government is, if anything, going to strengthen the law and make more and more attempts to silence the opposition and independent NGOs.
Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze has recently appeared on a conference which took place in Hungary. And of course, one of the main headliners there was Viktor Orban. Were you surprised that this has actually happened?
No, definitely not. We've seen Viktor Orban being allied to whomever he sees as a way to strengthen his own position. I strongly believe that, if anything, Orban is egocentric and wants to make his own life in the EU as good as possible. So anybody he sees as friendly to his way of seeing the world, which is very conservative, illiberal. Let's remember, he himself boasted that he is going to turn Hungary into an illiberal democracy. So whomever he sees as a potential ally in that crusade, is ultimately his friend, because I strongly believe that Orban's aim is to weaken the EU and NATO in pursuit of his aims, and he just uses others as a tool to achieve those goals. In the past, your viewers will be surely aware that he used the former Polish government of the PIS as an ally. That no longer applies. So he's looking for new allies, be it inside or outside the EU. So to answer your question, no, I'm not surprised at all.
Okay, Ján Michalčák, political scientist and international security expert. Thank you very much for joining us at TVP World.
Thanks for having me.